moving on to our first intervention of the day. We're going to have an excerpt from Alex Singh's filmed performance of The Humans, which will be followed by a conversation between Alex, an artist based in New York and Paris, who works across a variety of media, including film, installation, and sculpture. And he'll be in conversation with Donatien Grau, writer, philosopher, and curator, currently working on a show at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles on Plato in LA.
These numbers that we're calling out right now are, by the way of being, our names.
31,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
9.
Many. In this studio here we work all the live long day, and what's our reward?
Why, there's scarcely any.
But how else is it that we could live? Why, we haven't even got a clue in that respect, dear audience.
We're just the same as you. For work is good, oh, work is holy. Whether done fast or even slowly, we live to toil to make from matter more man of soil to work the plaster. We do not think what we should do. When we hear orders, then we snap to.
Come now, faster.
For work is holy, it's why we exist, why we exist. Charles Ray, our fabricator, we must assist, we must assist.
We work for master, we toil for him, so now bring plaster
And mix water in, right to the brim.
Faster still.
We help to mold those body parts, like bones and hearts, like bones and hearts, from which our Lord creates his art. Each does its part, each does its part. He's our producer, we toil for him, and as we labor, we sing this hymn. We sing this hymn in praise to him. We sing and sing, we sing and sing in praise to him. We sing in praise to sing. We sing in praise to him.
Come now. A great many labors still lie before us.
Man listens, man obeys.
Ye three, to the molds for noses and breasts to attend. Ye others, on buttocks, great nipples, and chests now moil, and do pour out great number, for in those parts we are most sorely lacking.
Sire, could I, if I might...
These joints, what call you them?
Oh, knees, sire.
They be of poor metal indeed, most like to wear out quite deleteriously.
There's something I'd like to ask.
Be sure that they are reinforced.
Yes, sir, I will.
And this?
The appendix, you see, could I just...
Quite superfluous, be sure that it is removed.
Of course,
Yeah, and these tonsils too.
yes. I could really do with some advice.
Oh, print is mine. Too long hast thou in wayward fecklessness been mired. Nay, but now I sense thou seeks new leaf to o'erturn.
Oh, sure, why not?
I prithee, Topole, do remember always, and this above all else, Topole,
Yes?
always to thine own self be truly attentive in the washing of thy hands, the cleaning of work surfaces, the brushing of floors, maintenance of espresso machine, and so it must follow as night doth follow and as night, that if thou canst an ordered studio keep, An ordered mind wilt thou most surely reap.
Yeah, well, that's just the thing, you see.
Wash your hands off them!
There's this girl.
The blute, I say!
And lately I just can't stop thinking about her.
For cleanliness is next to... A girl?
No, a girl? No, of course not. Don't be ridiculous. A woman.
A woman?
No. I tell a lie. A lady.
A harlot!
A dame!
Harlot, top hole! Dost thou not comprehend that thou art an Apollonian spirit? The Apolline calling is the very noblest.
Yes, I know. Do the books, mop the floor, clean the kilns,
Make the coffee, to strive to bring the organizing principles of order, rationality, and reason to a wild and chaotic universe. But now thou comes unto me not with sprightly head held high, but with a pate bowed low by the swirling tides of amorousness. Mayhap 'tis not only these statues that doth require careful examination and calibration.
Maybe I'll just give a little preamble. The 5-minute extract that you've just seen is a scene from a theatre play that I wrote and directed in 2013-14 called The Humans. In many ways, this day could be seen as a look at how contemporary artists have reacted to classical art. But I'd really like to open up the conversation to also include the way that artists, contemporary artists, filmmakers, theatre makers have also been influenced by classical literature, philosophy, history, classical culture in general. The title of The Humans is derived, it's a bit of a nod and a wink to the plays of Aristophanes, which are often eponymously titled after the nature of the chorus. For example, plays like The Birds, The Frogs, and another person I might want to mention, who is an influence on this work, albeit a slightly smaller one, is the 2nd century satirist Lucian of Samosata, who, if you haven't read his work, it's wonderfully funny, feels incredibly contemporary, very Woody Allen-esque. And an interesting point in terms of the relationship between Lucian and Aristophanes is that whilst we may think of these as both classical texts, Aristophanes is writing and performing during the golden age of Athens, when Athens is carrying out the Peloponnesian War, not very successfully. Some 700 years later, during the time of the Roman Empire, you have an upstart writer from the provinces, from Syria, who finds himself in ancient Athens, then contemporary Athens, writing satires that are paeans to Aristophanes' work. They're written in a very archaic style, the high Attic style, even though Aristophanes predates him by 700 years. So while we may look at this span of history as being one and the same, in fact, there's a continuous nostalgia in classical culture, which I find very invigorating, very timeless. In the Aristophanes play The Frogs, the god Dionysus appears and decides that he wants to visit the playwright Euripides, who's in Hades, he's dead. And so they go on an equivalent to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure on a pilgrimage down to Hades. And Dionysus expresses that he has, uses the Greek word pothos, a yearning nostalgia for the work of Euripides. And quite often in Aristophanes' plays, you'll find tensions between generations, especially in plays like The Wasps or The Clouds. You have a conflict between a father and a son. In The Humans, we witnessed a similar conflict between a character called Charles Ray, who is inspired by the Los Angeles sculptor, who's maybe Donati would agree, a great Platonist, a believer in the purity of sculptural form, and his son Top Hole, who is the young sorcerer's apprentice, or like Miranda in The Tempest, not really happy with the role that he's been assigned to labor in the studio all day. They labor creating statues, and this is the chorus that we first encounter, and this is the scene where they enter, the parados of the chorus. This Top Hole will encounter a young lady who he's already fallen in love with, whose name is Pantalingua. Her mother is the Dionysian spirit, who is Charles Ray's ancient enemy, ex-lover. Her name is N, and she is a chocolate bunny who cannot speak but communicates only through dance, who's quite inspired by the Queen of the Night from Shakespeare's The Magic Flute. There's a similar sort of night and day
Mozart's Magic Flute.
And then Pantalingua decides that the creation of the world is a terrible thing because it will cause much suffering and pain, and the creator of the universe is vainglorious and a real man. And so she rebels against him, and she seduces or convinces Tophold to go along with her in her plan to stop the creation of the world. Unfortunately, as in many creation myths, things go wrong, and their attempts to prevent the creation of the world actually accelerate its creation, and every accident has an unforeseen consequence, which brings the world closer and closer to the way we see it now. And the crux of the story is in the second act, when Pantalingua asks one of the statues to excrete, to shit, because this is what her mother does. This is the Dionysiac spirit's role, and she wants to mix the Apolline and the Dionysian together. Now, statues can't excrete because they don't eat, because they're not alive, and so she takes him through the motions of going to the bathroom, which involves first squatting, then groaning, reading a magazine, and after much a very lowbrow hilarity, the statue does excrete, rises, and rubs his stomach, and for the first time feels a panging loss, as if a part of him is missing. This part that he wants to replace by now gorging himself. And he also starts to feel other desires course through his marble limbs, sexual desire, desire for wealth, for power. And very quickly he becomes the human being that we recognize in day-to-day life, and also from the anarchic world of an Aristophanes play. And at that moment the statues don grotesque masks, which we're quite familiar with from antiquity, and then behave much more like a classic Aristophanic chorus. They decide to kill the gods, take over the world, and hold a trial at the end of the play, what's referred to in Greek comedy as an agon, or a contest. In this case, it's a literal trial where they put their gods on trial and then sentence them to exile. So, a brief summation of the play.
You probably understand that this is a nerdy moment. I have two questions at least for you. I'll start with this one. You made a rhetorical coup de force by saying that, contemporary artists, playwrights, filmmakers, as if there was the same thing, and so somehow separating yourself from the category of contemporary art, which you also did, saying your interest is in contemporary culture as much as it is, or maybe more than it is, in formal contemporary art. But on the other hand, you are that, you could say, semi-scholarly interest that you've just shown, but your categories are still the one of a modern. For instance, every classicist knows that Apollinian and Dionysian doesn't mean anything to a Greek.
Yes, it's a 19th century.
Yeah, well, and that Vilamovitz in the 1872 review of Nietzsche's book says it's rubbish, which it is. So, so my question to you is, how do you combine the fact that whether you want it or not, you are a contemporary artist, and whether you want it or not, you are engaging, and we can see it with, classical iconography, as well as aiming for a very different sort of relationship?
I would try to explain my relationship to the past. I often quote from an essay by Borges, the Argentinian writer, called Kafka and His Precursors. Well, I call it an essay. It's wonderfully short. It's only a page, paperback page, in which he is sitting in his armchair, and he's scanning the titles of his books, and he sees a medieval Chinese text. He sees a variety of texts, and he thinks to them, wow, these stories are very Kafkaesque. And then he's reminded of the fact that Kafka did not exist at the time that these people were writing their books. He thinks of the way that every writer, in a sense, builds upon the work or digests the work of previous writers, and that each person in the contemporary moment, their work creates a new prism or a set of glasses. I don't know if you've seen the opera, the Tales of Hoffmann, in which he dons a pair of special glasses which transform his view. Every contemporary artist's work creates a new set of glasses through which to look at works of the past and to see them in new ways. So my interest in Aristophanes is not purely from the vantage point of the intervening 2,000 years. It's the way Aristophanes influenced later Roman writers, Plautus. His spirit is there in Lucian of Samosata. But then that becomes really relevant with the humanist writers, pre-humanist, Rabelais, then Cervantes, the sort of comic tradition of Serio Ludera, which leads all the way up into Monty Python and South Park. There's a tradition where you see people building upon this work, and they will refer to it either explicitly or implicitly. So in the end, I see myself in a very long tradition, eating the leftovers of many previous meals.
That leads to many other questions, but I want to, I was very fortunate to be quite involved in the genesis of the humans, and we once did an interview for a Dutch magazine called Metropolis some 5 years ago, and you were in the process of, producing the humans. And you said, and I quote you, in ancient Greek theater, the director was called the didaskalos, which means teacher, from which we get the word didactic. In the Frogs, Aristophanes said that children have a teacher to educate them, whilst men have the poets. So what is the nature and the reason of your use of what was known in the 12th century as the stuff from Rome, or the stuff from Athens?
How do you mean?
Well, you don't know that phrase? That's a classical phrase that's used in the 12th century to talk about the material from the antiquity, the stuff from Athens, the stuff from Rome. So obviously you mentioned that use the position of the didaskalos as being the position of a teacher. Do you teach? Why do you have to go and rewrite Aristophanes and Lucian of Samosata? Why don't you do something else?
Well, because it's a silly thing to do. It's totally anachronistic, and it comes out of a pure love, and the absurdity of doing it now is what motivated me.
Absurdity?
Yes.
Why?
It's a pure pleasure. I think...
Do you think, some people think here maybe that classical art and culture is really relevant and important now. So do you think it's absurd? You said absurdity?
Well, I don't think it ever goes away. There's T.S. Eliot, who we think of as a quite modern poet, was himself very conservative. This is a strand we see in quite a few, especially poets and writers. People like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope were actually quite conservative figures. Perhaps Aristophanes was himself. And T.S. Eliot made The Wasteland, a seminal work of modern poetry. He himself was enamored with classical poetry, and he stated that, to his mind, to make, at that time, in the early 20th century, a poem in the exact meter and style of one from the heyday of classical Rome would be, in and of itself, even though it seems like a really retrograde, reactionary thing to do, by the nature of him making it in a new context, it would be a valuable and new work of art. Does that make sense, Warren?
I think you are toying with three different stances, and I would love for you to clarify how you deal with the three. One is to say that the reference to Aristophanes and to Lucian of Samosata and to Hesiod, who was also one of the figures that nurtured the whole notion of a creation myth, you're using the word conservative. This interest would be conservative. Then there's another layer, which is the permanence of humanity. The fact you also mentioned South Park and Woody Allen,
yes.
And so you think that there is a line that goes from Aristophanes to South Park and Woody Allen, which is of course very interesting. And then there's a third layer, which you just referred to, with T.S. Eliot. It's that there is a modernity in shifting, using the material and shifting it, placing it in different contexts.
I would say that for me, the latter is a conversation that it's a more critical conversation. It's not something that I acknowledge that it's happening. I'm not oblivious to the fact that I made a new version of a 2,000-year-old play, but it's not something that motivates me in any way near the level as perhaps the second concern. When we did the project in Rotterdam, there was a series of conversations between academics that we held called causeries. One of them was with the British classicist Edith Hall, and Edith Hall described, as in her preamble, her fascination with this world. She said it felt like a parallel universe, almost like a Lord of the Rings. It's our own civilization, but anterior in time. And what's quite striking when you read these texts is just how contemporary they can feel and how the banal problems of our age are echoed across time. It may have been the case that in ancient Sumer or Assyria or the Harappan civilization that people also criticized collectors of books who didn't actually read the books that they owned, or rich people would hold parties and invite poets to attend them, even though they themselves had pretensions to being a poet but weren't not as talented as them. You get art criticism, criticism of the nouveau riche. They've always been nouveau riche. And the most perennial topic is the fact that fathers don't understand their sons because their sons spend all their money on horse races and chariot racing, and they have long hair, and the meter of the poems that they sing at the symposia are completely different to the ones that my father and my great-grandfather sang to, and that they are fritting about in wars with Sparta, whereas we defeated the Persians. Now, this is a sort of a nostalgia that you see in Greek culture, and you also see it a lot in Roman culture, because as far as the Romans are concerned, the late Roman Empire is a tragedy compared to the glory days of the Republic, characters like
Well,
Brutus.
the late days of the Republic are already a tragedy.
Yes, compared to Tarquin and the imperial times, and before that there was the Hellenistic period, and so there's always this looking back thinking that life is bad because today things are dim, my eyesight is not good, I can't get an erection, my son doesn't listen to me, my wife is having an affair. This concern is completely universal, and to see it echoed throughout history is quite, it's fun.
Do you think, I mean, I have, you know, as a classicist myself, I have some concerns with the way you see history and the way people behave in a very individual manner. So you read this text as if they were stating something of their time. But you know, there are some classicists who have made the absolutely opposite reading, which is the whole point you have. The whole point Suetonius is telling us about the fact that Nero, you know, was had sex with his mother and was, you know, was crazy and beat up people and all that, is because he's trying to make him into a person, which by definition he's not. So that there is a whole biographical writing that is part of the process of ancient poetry and historiography, actually no, rather not poetry but historiography and biography, which is why that sort of biographical element you will find more in comedy than you will find in tragedy, actually. Ancient Greek comedy rather than tragedy.
I think this assertion is absolutely ridiculous.
I completely disagree.
You disagree? I think it's ridiculous because as soon as there were cavemen, we've seen the New Yorker cartoons, complaining about how his cave is bigger than mine, and I can't catch enough.
Yeah, but what I'm
bison.
saying...
There's always been individuals, even though we think of the individual as maybe a more modern, perhaps, humanist, Renaissance, even late 19th century construct. There's always been characters, and there's always been conflicts, and the personality of the individual has always been very important in society.
Do you think that there is a permanence of the individual from the ancient times until now?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Well.
We'll have a conversation. You and I will have a private conversation on that.
How are we doing for time?
Well, that's why, because I want to ask you one more.
3 minutes. What can we cover in 3 minutes?
Well, I have one thing I want to cover. I won't go into the whole history of the individual, but let's actually say something, because your position on the individual is a late modern stance on ancient antiquity. I mean, I personally think that nobody would have thought like you in ancient Greece and Rome.
But isn't the central, this is a terrible assertion, and here I'm stating a sort of A-level first-year undergraduate assertion, but isn't the whole point, for example, of tragedy that the individual is forced to choose between two sets of ethical codes? The ancient code...
Do you really think he chooses?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, the whole point is that they can't choose.
That they
they're
don't
forced
choose.
to choose. They don't choose. Or maybe that's the tragedy, that they're not allowed to choose.
Yeah,
But still,
so then they're not, you know, I mean...
but still, they're an individual who is suffering this lack of choice. And it's upon them to make the choice between, should I follow the laws of religion and how to bury, that my brother should be buried, or do I follow the laws of the state, that I have to listen to my brother-in-law who's now the king?
Should I? I mean, I think the whole point of should I, and the whole sentence, the whole phrase should I, I'm not I mean, if you think of any tragedy, the whole point is that they are crushed. You know, I think... And
No, the whole point is that they have the hope that if they somehow do this or that, then they're going to avoid indictment.
But do you think they do? No.
They don't, but they have hope. And that's what the hope is. Maybe that's what tragedy is, false hope. Yeah. And